Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Hospitality Marketing, live show number 362. I'm your host, Lauren Gray, and thank you for joining us live today. And for those that will be listening to us in replays, thank you for doing that as well. We want to welcome everyone in all of the countries that are following us on all the platforms: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, multiple platforms in all of them. Plus, of course, our live TV broadcast on Roku, Google, Amazon, and Apple on our Hospitality Channel TV station. So thank you all for watching us there as well. So let's jump into it. Our topic today is a continuation in some ways to our topic last week because it's a more granular perspective in a certain way of this. And I'll explain this as we go forward. Last week's discussion, of course, was how to create accurate demand forecasting. And we broke into a lot of categories of information, which we'll get back to as a recap. But more importantly, we want to talk about today's episode, which is how to define your feeder markets with real data. I find oftentimes talking with clients around the table or on Zooms or whatever have you, everybody has opinions about where they think people are coming from. And of course, the best source of relevant current demand to your hotel is people at the property level themselves. Unfortunately, they're not attuned to looking at the segmentations in a way that is market useful. They will look at people coming in and they'll say they're older or younger, they have family, they kids, they don't have kids, younger kids, older kids, and those are all relatively helpful. But the details, the granularity of what we need is more into the data that they see on the screens when people are being checked in. And that is a lot of the geography that they're coming from. Another thing that often gets overlooked, or at least not accumulated in some sort of usable data format, is the purpose of travel. Are they here for an event, for a sporting event, for an entertainment event, for a family event? It's obvious that when you look at your PMS data that you can see group blocks and people attending because of things that were already preordained, registered, and what have you. And in some degree, you can even look at your segmentations based on the type of business: corporate travel versus pure transient travel. Consortias, wholesalers, sources of business do lend themselves, even with OTAs, as to where they derived their connection to your hotel for them staying. But it doesn't tell you your feeder market. Okay. Now, last week's conversation about demand forecasting was a lot about finding sources of data that are useful to determine how much demand is coming into your market. We've in previous show, I think actually show number 359, we talked about pace and trend. And these were indicators that are used in marketing as well as yield of revenue management in determining where and for what people were coming to you for. That was a reflection of the reality of data that was coming in, but not necessarily the source of the data that you need to use. In our discussion last week about demand forecasting, we talked about sources of information that were helpful. Things as simple as Google Trends, um, meta search platform data, geosource data from your PMS, feeder market data from your PMS, which is again similar to the idea of not just geographies, but for what purpose were they traveling, like were they coming in for group blocks and what have you. And of course, any reconstitution of engagement with your ad campaigns for retargeting, how that works in the sense of what focus the retargeting did. Like, for instance, if you were to set up a retargeting for your paid ad campaigns and said anybody that touched our ads, whether if they didn't buy anything, we want to take those people, put them into an audience, and retarget them on other platforms. And from that, we would derive some data that would associate what their engagement level was in categories that we can use, like geography, type of interest, date of interest, where they connected with us. So we had some sense of their intent and interest in where they were in the decision process. Of course, all other data that is more historically traditionally used, your booking pace, your arrival dates, your length of stays, your departure dates, are all useful for when it comes to revenue management and also marketing. But those, again, are a resultant of what's happening, not the catalyst of what to create for marketing. So that's where we're going to dive in a little bit deeper today about the actual feeder market. How can you use and derive real data? Now, some examples of this come from the concept of asking the right questions. If you're looking at who's coming in this weekend, you're late to market to them unless there's some spontaneity, which people do have. But given current economics of finances, inflation, distances of travel, challenges of travel, ability to travel, and resources of travel, you have a very complex combination of basically two segments. We're going to, again, focus primarily on transient as our focus of discussion. You have either the choice of drive market or fly market. In all essence, that's the two major ways of transportation modality. From that, you derive feeder markets. Drive market feeder markets are different up to a point than fly markets. Fly markets are different up to a point than drive markets. And what I mean by up to a point, there's a range of drive markets that is a flux of whether people decide to fly for convenience or drive for cost. That's usually at around the 450, 500-mile mark. Uh, it could be slightly less than 400 miles. It's a range where you spend all day traveling to get somewhere. Um, Once you get past that to staying over and then traveling again, there comes a point where you have to decide, is it easier or valuable to fly versus drive? Now, some of the influences on that, as we've discussed, of course, is fuel costs and airline lift convenience and availability for the dates and times that you're looking for. Plus, also given the news coverage, the challenges associated with air flight travel, the uncertainty of showing up to an airport and being stuck in the line outside the building because it's so busy you can't get inside the building to get your flight and you miss your flight and so forth and so on. It's made enough newsworthiness out of it. And a lot of people locally will know their individual airports, general news coverage as to whether it's having problems or not having problems. A lot of the ones that make national coverage or international coverage are the New Yorks, the Miamis, the Chicago's, and what have you, where people are stuck. We see internationally Heathrow is now limiting how many departures passengers per day to alleviate some of the chaos that they made national or international news for. So those have influences on whether people will actually take on the arduousness of diluting their time on vacation to consume it for travel. It does change its perspective as to whether or not at that point the travel to the destination is a part of the vacation experience or it's just a facility of getting there. And that comes from the purpose of travel, which goes back to our data collection. A lot of what we have to look at is where people are coming from to come to us. And that is, by definition, our feeder markets. Traditionally, it's been, what does our PMS say? We look at if you can pull this information. Brands have a little more of a challenge to this. Um, Pull the data historically, same time last year. Where were these people coming from last year? Um, was there any sort of information related to why they were coming? Was it event driven? Was there a concert? And we're having the same concert again. Is it the seasonal demand? It's summer. People are coming because we are a summer destination. Um, these are criteria for beginning to create parameters of your feeder market. These aren't real data sources. These are interpretations of perspective. They're simply looking at the captain obvious points of data that you're looking at. Zip codes that people are coming to. Is that a repeatable demand area? And that starts getting into where you begin to find data. To discover data, you take your assumptions of what you're looking at as captain obvious points and saying, is there validity to think this is a recurring demand? Is there a reason why people from a certain geographic location came to our area last year before that? Remember, we talked about average weighted mean. We persistently talk about average weighted mean data, meaning that we take data prior to COVID, during COVID, and now as we deal with the changes in COVID's impact on our society, we take an average weighted mean data. So we're not just skewing it with last year's hybrid performance in summer or 2020's barren wasteland of no performance compared to 2019's before we knew the pandemic was going to happen. You aggregate all that together. So you look at the repeatability of the data sources. Is there a reason why these people will be coming back? If so, then the next step question is, who are these people? Classify them in categories that are marketable. This is where we go into the persona discussions. How can we identify them as a persona? Are they a young family, an old family, a family that doesn't have kids with them? Are they single? Are they married? Are they traveling in groups? These are all variables as to determining what is the business cycle decision process for them. What I mean by this, let's take some examples. A business traveler traveling for their own transient interest, where it's pleasure, let's say. They're coming for business, but they want to stay longer. We're not going to drive them on the typical marketing strategies of showing up on a Saturday morning in their inbox if we were to send them an email, because that's not when they go through their discovery process for their purchase decisions. That's more for a family and them to have it in their inbox on a Saturday when they have the latitude of time to look a little bit closer at the offers that you're presenting to determine if they have an influence on their purchase decisions. So, knowing the segmentations of whom you're talking to will dictate your marketing strategy. That data is useful. Um, Looking at confirming what you have as impressions of your Captain Obvious data, which is, well, a lot of people came from X location. Oh, great. And they came during this time because they come this time of year from there. Repeatabilities. A good example of this is Hollywood, Florida. People coming from Canada, like Hollywood, Florida. It was a traditional, repetitive family vacation location in Florida for people coming from central Canada, the Torontos, the Quebec cities, Montreals, that area. A lot of people came from to Hollywood, Florida, because that was a repeatability of their family vacation. There's a long story we had in previous shows about how that all got created. Anyways, the idea is that with these assumptions, you look for validation. You ask a query and you look for supporting or damning evidence. Do we have the data to support this theory, or do we have the evidence to dispel this theory? And that is a decision that always goes on with any of this. Empirical data, is this a point of data that validates our assumption? So you look at trends. Now, some of the things that come from trends is in the strangest of places. And I keep referring to this article from the New York Times because I find it incredibly valuable. I know the data is rather stale at this point. It's a relatively old article, although I do get the impression that they have been keeping some aspects of it up to date. Um, they decided to pull data on Facebook communication traffic. In other words, from point A to point B. If you're in point A, who do you talk to as point B in your Facebook dialogue the most? It was a very interactive map, very detailed in a sense down to county level, where you could put the cursor over, and I'll put the link in the show notes for you to look at. You put the cursor over a location in the continental United States, and actually all 50 states, it's not even just continental United States, all 50 states, and it would show you in a color map by county what range of people that they talk to. And what you find interesting is in some places, and if you look down to where you're pointing the cursor, you see that there are some very strong communications in all parts of the country, which lends itself as to why would that part of the country be so well connected to the other part of the country. Now that asks the second question: is like, is there a purpose to this? Now, some of the disclaimers of potential for this is, well, is there a college relationship? Kids going to college? Is this a relocation of family where the family keeps in communication? Is this a move from location and they have old family and friends there and they keep communicating that way? Um, those are usually presumptive first easy ones, but the idea is that it gives you kind of a broad brush perspective of correlations between your location and other locations. Like, why is it that I click on a county in Arkansas and strangely enough, a place in Indiana shows up as a strong connector? What is the point between those two that makes that interesting? And it's not that you so much have to have the understanding of the exact every reason why those connections are there, but it gives you kind of a compass point to say it's worth looking into why those places have a high density of traffic between those two locations. You can go back and forth between the locations to see if it keeps correlated between the two and the froms and so forth. It makes it very fascinating. So this kind of stick in the mud empirical inference as to the data values is a great way of just beginning to get your directions as to where you would like to go. It's fine. That's not real data. That's implied data. This is just, hey, that's interesting that that's the case. What you have to do is go past that point into the world of, is there validation for data that I do have? And this goes into your PMS system. If you've isolated certain markets that you feel have a correlation for something as simple as we just discussed with the Facebook, who's talking to who, where in the country, then you make a list of that. Say, okay, here's the places that seem interesting enough by value of volume of traffic that is indicated in this graphic, and say that this is worth just wondering why. Make a list. Now, that list by itself is not going to be an end all solution to you. You need to find another source of other data. And this goes into the world of using some of the free tools we've talked about before, like Google Trends. It's a blunt instrument for some of the things we're talking about, but it is, again, a great compass point, a barometer as to validating an assumption. So you go into trends and you look for not your hotel, not your restaurant, but your market. Particularly, you might just want to start to keep things similar, your county in the state, maybe even just your state, and see where geographically other people look from about your state. And just see if that kind of matches your original list that you got, say, from your Facebook correlations, as to whether or not there's some sort of commonality. I'm definitely guarantee you there is not identical uh, points to this, but it does validate some of the same of the first list to the second list that you've created. So you keep that list. You put another list together of the places that you see in Google Trends, and then you might want to go next granular and say, okay, because it'll give you suggestions in Google Trends as to what things are correlated to the search that you're looking at. And you might go over and get a little bit more granular into your county or into your city. And you'll see if that correlation stays the same. It might change dramatically, it might change very little, but whatever stays the same, you keep in a list. So now you have three lists: Facebook correlation of traffic, general trend interest into your general area, specific interest into your general interest in your specific area. So you're building a list, and there will be correlations. If you're doing a Google sheet or go to an Excel sheet, something that you're going to be able to use pivot tables for, and you then go over and say, okay, now if these people wanting to travel from there to here, um, do I have evidence of that in my PMS? So you can go into your PMS and pull up, and you might have to look up the zip codes of these locations. You find the zip codes of the areas that are in those three lists. Um, and you see if those zip codes exist in your PMS. Yes. Okay, great. Not right now determining what time of year we're looking at yet. We're just looking at general interest to your market. Look for the numbers associated with those zip codes, make a list. Put beside it the value of the dates that those people stayed. Okay. This might be a separate sheet. Just take it and say, okay, here's everybody from here's all the zip codes from the areas that correlate with the three little lists I've made. Here's all the people by dates, okay, dates of those zip codes. How often those, when did those people from those zip codes stay? You're then going to create a sheet that will pivot the zip codes to the dates, so that now you have a calendar list, and then you have zip codes with the highest number of places beside the dates that they tended to stay. And it's going to be all over the board. It's going to be zip code here, zip code down there, because it's not just a guaranteed concentrated area, but you will see an emerging pattern of density, that, or at least a point in your calendar list, that these zip codes show up frequently. So these people tend to travel from that area to your location around this time. You're beginning to see that. Now that came from your PMS data. And like I said, you don't have to, it would be great to go back 4 years, but in all honesty, you can go back as far as you have the data available. Okay. So now you have this correlation of the areas that seem to fall in these three lists that you've created from Facebook, from trends, from general to specific location interest of your area. And now you've looked at your historical data of your PMS to confirm that, yes, these people are traveling from there. So now ask yourself, how do they get to you from those areas? And that goes to our first part of the conversation of flight versus drive. Obviously, some of these areas will be in a very close proximity. Matter of fact, a lot of these areas will be in close proximity. And because of that, it's easy to calculate that that is a drive market demand. This area here, this range of 400 miles or less, is most likely drive market. Not saying that people don't fly for short hops, but most likely they're a drive market. Anything outside of that range is most likely a fly market, which goes to where we're going to go next in our discovery of data. How do they fly to us? Now, we know that the airline system is based on hubs, meaning that there are centric areas that each carrier has that is their basic hub of where they fly in and through for their connecting flights, and most of where their mechanicals, their airplanes, fly in combination with. That's where their service facilities are, their staffing facilities, their organizational facilities mostly are. For instance, Dallas is American Airlines, Atlanta is Delta. You get the idea. Anyways, so hubs aren't necessarily your source of travel, but they are connected to the travel. So if you have these areas that you see are definitely fly market based on what we've identified geographically. What feeds those markets? What carriers go to the airports around those areas? What airports would they use in those areas? Obviously, if they're in Dallas, they're going to use Dallas airports, kind of a given. Um, if they're not in the hub cities themselves, what feeds those cities that they are in most? So that's where you start digging. Now, some of the easy stuff is to literally go to places like FlightAware, okay, and look at airports in the area and see what's flying in and out. Now, a Captain Obvious way of looking at this is just looking at the flights of that day. You can pay for historical data or you can create your own data. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about garnering data in just a minute. We're just going to talk about the value of data at the moment. So here I'm looking at the arrivals and departures of a particular airport that would be the airport used for one of these markets that we've identified, this area of places that people come from that show up for people's search queries. We've gone to this point that we have validated that this is a worthy interest consideration feeder market. We do get people from these areas. We've shown that people do look at us from these areas, look for our area from their area, and that we see from a social perspective there is a connection between people in that area and our area. So we've validated the interest in this area, these areas. And this is a one by one thing. There's no simple silver bullet to this. This is ditch digging, grunt grinding work. So now you look at these and you see all the places that get fed to these airports. What you're looking for is to see the correlation between the air carriers in these markets to the air carrier that is in your market. So it is easy enough to go to your own airport on their website and see what air carriers come to your airport. Who feeds your market? What carriers come to your market? A Captain Obvious data point would be when you see United and American Airlines and Delta, you know that there's probably some traffic of some capacity going from their hubs of Atlanta and Dallas and LaGuardia. You know that they're going to be doing that. Okay. That being said, what flights go through those places to you have to be connected to the market you're looking for. Now, there's ways to extract historical data over time. There's a term called scraping. Scraping is being able to extract data from a website by indicating the data points that you want and then putting it into a format that you can use for analysis. Okay. I'm not talking about illegal anything. It's just a matter of gathering data that isn't immediately present. We've in the podcast today, we'll talk about 3 tools in particular that can do this, that can create automations for you to begin to garner data and ways of extracting data and putting it into a format that you can use for analysis, and a tool that will actually do the analysis for you to create what's called correlations of confidence, meaning by comparing data, it creates a scale of how relevant these 2 points of data or multiple points of data are to each other and give you a confidence score that says it is 85% likely that there is a correlation of impact, that when item A happens, it affects item B. This is how data analysis and statistical variations work, is impact data. It's one thing to have data, but if there's no correlation, for instance, well, I've told this story before, but when we first started working with data, and we started using it on Watson, actually, which you can do from anyway. We went over through a bunch of data and my data person, great guy, comes back and says, I found my first high confidence correlation, 95% confidence, which means it's almost certain. I mean, there's always variances of error. He says that the more people spend time at the hotel, the more money they spend. Good point. Kind of a Captain Obvious statement, but we had now the data to validate that the longer people stay at our hotels, the more money they spend with us. Kind of a no-brainer for us. Length of stay, multiple days, they pay per day, they're going to spend more money with us. But the idea that data and confidence works in that way is that what is data for usage. So one of the tools that I use out of a couple of them, just to give it, is one's called HexaWatch. HexaWatch. Another one is Browse AI, and we'll talk about these in the podcast today as well. These are platforms that you can go to someplace like a website like FlightAware. I'm not saying to go to FlightAware, but like FlightAware and other places like that. And you'll see that there are data tables on there indicating to where people are flying to and from. You see it on the news a lot of times that they'll show you this map of little airplane models flying across the country and all the density of flights, where they are and how many planes are in the sky and all this other stuff. And it's fascinating to see that, but that's actual data to show where all those planes are. Well, that data is extractable by how you indicate it. And if you go to the airports, if you go to the airport that you have and begin to extract the data of all the arrivals and all the departures to begin to get a pattern of where they're going to and where they're coming from. And then you go to the airports that would feed the markets that you are looking at, okay, for markets that have the correlation of interest based on Facebook, interest based on searchability based on Google. Google Trends is our example that we're using for this discussion. Then you know that these are high areas of probability that where people living in these areas like being connected to the area that you're in and therefore would have an intrinsic interest in what you have to offer about being a hotel or a restaurant in that market. With that, if you begin to track their flights in their airport, your flights in your airport, you begin to see the dedication of traffic from their market as to how they get to your market via flight. Again, we're not talking about drive market at this point. We had that discussion actually in show 358, I believe it was. Yes, 358. We talked about how um, drive market was affected by gas and range and cost per dollar and percentage of total spend on of their travel expenses and the correlations of values of accommodations and everything else. We had that very vibrant discussion associated with all the costs associated with travel and drive market in particular. So you definitely recommend you go back to that show, listen to the breakdowns on how we calculated drive value cost of fuel and its impact on the amount of money spent on accommodations versus entertainment versus food, all that. We talked about national averages. It was a fun discussion. Again, data heavy. Today we're talking again, of course, about feeder markets. So now we're talking about airlift feeder markets. We begin to track data coming into your airport and traffic data of inbound and outbound for your airport and inbound and outbound for the markets of high interest that you are looking at to see the correlation of amount of lift that the air carriers are providing between the markets that are interested in you and their ability to get to your market. Once you see what air carriers and when they're coming in and the frequency that they're coming in, and these are just spreadsheets. This is data that gets pulled and put into a spreadsheet. I'm not here to teach scraping. We do this for clients to validate our data of demand, just why we're talking about it on the show today, even to validate that we know what airlift is coming into market and from the sources most likely that's coming in from beyond the hubs that are being used. If not, they're not direct flights already. Not every location that is a feeder market viewer would ever have a direct flight to you. Most of the direct flights to your market come from a hub in some combination, connecting flight or what have you. Unless you're a major destination market where people come directly to you, okay, it is unlikely that there is a direct correlation between the source of the flight and the destination, which is you. Usually it's correlating the source of the market, how it went through the hub, and then the hub to you. That correlation comes out very quickly when you start pulling this type of flight data because you'll see persistent flights from the hub of a particular carrier that are correlated by time when you start doing pivot tables on the sheet of flights that left from your potential high interest markets to get to the hub to get to you. Obviously, there's variations of an hour, 3 hours, sometimes even longer layovers. Okay. Unlikely that there's a night over layover. Okay. People don't go into a hub only to sleep the night there to get into the next flight unless that's the only way they can do it. Some restrictions happen like that. But most part, it's usually it leaves from the interest market, gets to the hub, and there's some latency factor before from the hub to your market. So following and connecting those threads will then begin to show you how many flights leave your high interest market and get to your market. What's the correlation to that? Once you have that, you have several points of data that are useful from this. We're only going to talk about a couple of them. One is overall lift impact. Okay. This is how many people, because you literally on these flights can determine the airlift, the type of plane. If a Embraer Air 40 passenger plane leaves, it's not saying it's always full, but if it leaves from your feeder, your interest market, and it is full, and it makes it to your hub that feeds your market, you can count 40-ish people potentially coming from your feeder market. Now, of course, you have multiple feeder markets, so you have to aggregate these numbers, but this is where the grunt work comes in. But if you know that those people are coming at this frequency once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, then you can count how many people are probably coming in market from your feeder market. You also can look at the prices that they have to pay. Easy enough on Google Flights. Say, okay, make yourself that you're traveling from that market to your market. Now you can look at what do they have to spend to get to you over the time frames that you're interested in defining this data. Obviously, we have prices that go up and down. So there's times where it's very expensive to fly to your market from these markets, and that's going to have an impact on people that must never want to come to you during the time of demand. And then there's other times that it's not as expensive. That impacts kind of the conversations we had as to total ability of finance to spend for travel. We talked about this in, again, show 358, where we broke down the cost of travel. We cost the cost of accommodations, cost of travel, transportation, the cost of food per day, the cost of entertainment expenses per day, national averages to determine what the total cost is, and then compared that against average incomes to know what your threshold demographically is of people that can literally afford to make it as a travel to your market. You begin to have income thresholds. You determine how much money people need to be making or willing to borrow in that circumstance. Okay. Up to the point where it's not a financial burden to them, and whether you're still a consideration for their interest in travel. Whether now you've outclassed yourself, that they have enough money not to consider you if you're not of that caliber of type of resort or destination or whatever have you, that they're not going to even consider you because they have the money to spend even more towards their quality of travel. So we created these barriers of lows and highs. This is the minimum they need for income. This is probably the maximum that they have in income that is relevant to the product level that you have, which is your star ratings and your placement market and your product and everything else. We had those discussions. Please go back to show 358 to look at the details of that as well. But in this particular case, if we've determined there's a correlation between the market of interest, the lift that comes from that to go through the hub to get to you, the frequency of that, and to determine the cost associated with that, you now have a parameter of how to then define if this is a feeder market to market to. Because once you've defined, well, we know that the demographics, again, the personas that we talked about making for those people arriving during the time frame that we're looking to market for. And we say that these are the personas. This is a family of with kids at this age or not, or they're people traveling for a particular event. We know where they come historically from to get to the events. We validated those sources as being now beyond the point of market interest to being a potential feeder market. We then can go look, and this goes back to your paid campaigns. Whoever handles your paid marketing to say, okay, let's look at historically that geography or those geographies as to what we got for traffic to our website. And from our ad campaigns, did we get anybody from those markets? If so, every market has a certain cost, a cost per click. Okay. If I was, and let's give some tangible examples of this. If I have a hotel resort here in Florida, say Southwest Florida, where I live, and I've defined that there's a feeder market coming through Cincinnati to my market. And they use Delta because that Delta lift goes through Atlanta. Atlanta gets to me, or direct flights down to me because my local airport handles direct flights from Cincinnati. Then I've calculated the average lift associated with it. I've calculated the average price of that flight to me. And then I can calculate their total value of what income they need. So I have a parameter of income that's valuable. I then go into my analytics of my website and say, okay, how many people are coming from Cincinnati looking at my hotel website? And I get a number. Now, brand, you don't have that luxury. You don't have the ability to see that kind of traffic. The only traffic you can look at is your paid campaign traffic if anybody interacted from that geography. But continue with my original model. So then I look at the traffic from that market. Then I look at my paid traffic and whether or not there was an engagement from the market as well. If so, I look at what channels of communication were being used in the market. Is there paid campaigns that were reflective of that Cincinnati market? Was there a CRM? Was there emails related to that market? Historically, where did they, when they came from that market, what did they historically pay in ADR and length of stay? I begin to create a more defined persona by now. Not only do I know potentially who's coming in persona wise, but also geographically the purpose of their travel, their relative amount of money that they're spending, okay, their length of stay, their ADRs, but also their channel contribution in the sense of What channels do they engage with us on? How much of our email campaigns were successful to that market? How much of our paid campaigns were successful to that market? How much of our social media campaigns were successful to that market? We look at social media. Was it all organic engagement, paid engagement, no engagement? But we then begin to see the channel, the cost of the channel. How much money did we spend that fed that market? And what was the resultant of that? What was our return on that? What was our click through rates and conversions? And we can get to assess that. We can see that, well, and I'm making these numbers up on realistic data. It cost us $1.30 per click. We had a 4% click through rate. So we start calculating how much it costs to acquire that guest from that market. From that, we determine how much it would cost for us to acquire more guests from that market. With that being the case, we then can create a budget that says this is our Cincinnati budget. We have to offer rates that are in this range because we have historical rates that market paid for to be with us. And of course, obviously, that's modified with inflation that we have and everything right now. But relative market value, we know that they stay at average length of stay based on their source of market. From Cincinnati, they tend to come down and stay at least 3.5 days or 3 days or 3.2 or whatever it is. And we know that they tend to respond better to paid ad campaigns than social media campaigns or whatever have you. So if we spend X dollars based on the historical conversion value that we've had for that market, based on the cost per click that we have historical for that market, we can know that we can spend X dollars, say $300. We'll get this return on value for that investment in that market. And these are the dates that they tend to have highest interest in staying with us. So let's feature what we're offering for those dates. That is how you define with data your feeder markets to determine exactly how someone's going to be coming from a market to your market, their relative value to you, the relative cost to get them, and their relative interest in coming to you. That's the definition of feeder markets, of determining with data the reality of the source of results from that market. This goes beyond the subjective interpretations. Strangely enough, not to discount interpretation of raw data, like, oh, well, we see a lot of people coming with coolers, or we see a lot of people coming with young kids that are 6 or 7 years old, or we saw a lot of people driving and parking in the parking lot that aren't rental cars. They were driving their own vehicles. These are all helpful to start the process of discovery. But when you're sitting around your exec table trying to determine market strategy, and your revenue manager is trying to determine what rates to ask, or what the expected occupancy will be based on historical only data, you're getting into now supposition. Well, we think this, we hope this, we think, we saw this happening, so we think this is going to happen. That subjectivity, opinion subjectivity, is what often creates ambiguity and fear, because as you try marketing strategies based on these assumptions, any sign of lack of production creates uncertainty to pull the plug, when it may have just been a bad timing. It may have been bad targeting. It may have been a great idea, poor implementation at the wrong time. There's so many variables that can go into this. So you need the data for certainty of understanding when do you need to reach out, where do you need to reach out, with what do you need to reach out with, and what do you need to offer. And that only comes from having strong data, pulling strong data in to validate assumptions of, okay, where are the people coming from for this block of time? Let's look at the historicals. Once we look at the historicals, let's validate that with outside sources of data, like in Facebook, who talks to who, region to region. Let's look at trends and see what people are searching for, and geographically, who's the people most interested in searching for us or about us? Where are they located? Does that correlate with what we've had as historical bookings with us? Because what happens with just using one source of data, which is your historical, is it turns into a self-fulfilling cycle. If you're only going to approach the places that have had historical business with you, you're only going to get business from those same places. And if there's no more business to be gotten and you've maximized the business potential from that market, then you're going to feel like you don't have any more ability to increase top line revenue. I believe strongly in maximizing the sources of markets that have interest in you. Totally believe that, because that is literally fishing where the fish are. But I believe there should always be an interest in learning other markets that may be undiscovered, that have had tertiary interest in you, but never have gotten to a full contribution that is notable. Look at where other sources of geographic interest are. Look at categorically the demographics of people that are staying with you. Perhaps the only reason why a feeder market exists currently is because people discovered you and shared that with others, and they in turn shared it with others, and that feeder market is persistently connected to you. That opportunity may not have been created in another market. Therefore, it's not seeded itself into the same mechanicals where it's been word of mouth sharing, where people come down, and now it's presented as a feeder market. You constantly have to take the definitions of what people are coming for and why they're coming for it and applying it to other markets to see if there's a way of duplicating what you've done in a successful market in an undiscovered market. If they came from Cincinnati, why don't they come from Cleveland? In reference to my example, or why didn't they come from Akron? Is it the city itself, the demographics themselves? Maybe it's something as nuanced as I said, going back to Facebook and who talks to who. Maybe a lot of the kids went to college in Florida, and the families in that city come to the college because of that connection. Has nothing to do with the particular city as it does with the family connection of people going to school. Knowing and discovering this through proper perspective of the front desk when people really come in. Oh, what you're down here for? Oh, my kids are down in XYU, and we're down to see them for parents weekend or whatever. That's good to know. Then look at where they're from. See if that's an event driven thing that says every time XYU has a family or function that requires family interaction, we know that that's a great source to market to solidify their relationship with us for the purpose that they're traveling to our market. That's the definition of feeder markets with data. Determining with data the real numbers associated with why a place, location, or demographic is using our facilities. And by defining it with data and searching for that data and taking the time to aggregate that data, when you look at going up into the pyramid of discovery, the options get less, the complexity gets less, and the decisions become treated more clearly. For instance, as we've often talked about, when you're looking at business to the hotel, outside of ancillary food and beverage and what have you, or spas or golf, whatever, you have two fundamental sources of business, group and transient. That's two trunk tree. It fractions a lot after each one of them, but fundamentally above all those fractions are the two trunks. Is it transient or is it group? In transient, you begin to fraction down as to the source of the transient type business. You define at the most common denominator at first the purposes of the travel and any correlations related to it. Then, as you need to, you step down to more fractional so you can be more targeted to make sure that you're messaging correctly to the variation of that source of business. That's how you build marketing campaigns. Feeder markets are a discussion of that process. Once you've identified the segmentation, you identify the purposes of that segmentation. Why are we isolating this segmentation? Why are we defining them in such a way that we now can target what it is that they need to know about us, both in content and in channel, so they can make a purchase decision? That is the fundamental usages of feeder market data, is determining those causations for their travel purpose. Well, enough beating of the drum on this part to it. I think we've hit very well the feeder market data. I don't want to start going around in circles for that. We have discussed week past, obviously, the whole idea of demand forecasting, actual data created demand forecasting. The weeks before that, we talked about trend and pace and its comparison to ROI as a filter of success. So we've kind of really worked down into a very nitty gritty functional point of view how to break down what it takes to do this. Now, I say this with the caveat that this isn't for the hey, I just want to start doing this. Where do I start? This is where you're already functionally aware of what is going on to begin to refine what you need to do better. There's so many training facility programs out there that are trying to do basic training. What is PPC? What is CRM? What is tech stack? And it gets lost in the clutter of buzzwords like blockchain and crypto and VR. And the idea is there is a functional working process to this. The discussions we've had over the past few weeks from the show's perspective and the podcast perspective is about taking someone that is already knowledgeable in their field, that is sitting in a chair that they're experienced in, and refining more abstract perspectives of how to improve what it is that they're already doing. People showing up at your desk is like the old saying, every blind pig will find a turner. There will be people. You have a hotel, you have a sign out by the road. People will go, hey, I need a place to stay. They're going to get business to you. The idea of refining that to a strategic perspective of how can we yield our mathematical combination of occupancy and ADR and length of stay, how much people are willing to spend, how long are they willing to stay here to spend it, and how many people can we garner for that, is a function of understanding who you're talking to. Broadcasting that you are just available, it will get business for you, but it's not refined business. And that's going to be the differentiator between your operation and other operations is they're a hotel in the same market you're a hotel. Anybody driving down the road will look to the left and see you, look to the right and see them. Maybe not make the distinction of difference in service levels, may do the things that we talk about by looking at review scores or whatever, but they're not going to do it while they're driving. They're going to pull in, probably ask for a rate, look around, see the condition of the place, and make a determination just because that's the spontaneity of that decision. Those people will always be those people. I'm talking about the person that is pre-planning their travel to your market, that is trying to define what it is that they're interested in, why they're interested in traveling, the purpose of their travel, their willingness to spend based on the parameters of their budget, and the things that you do to create content, to know how to understand who those people are in such a way that rather than clutter broadcasting to anybody, you're broadcasting and communicating, not broadcasting, excuse me, communicating to them the value proposition that you have. And that's the real purpose of these discussions these past few weeks, is to granularly create a methodology of understanding of how do you tackle these things. How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? It's approaching it from a large solution with a small start. Break it apart, figure out what you need. What you need initially is a perspective to start from. And that comes from just observation, the Captain Obvious stuff that we refer to. The next is to validate those perceptions with data. Does the data support the perception or does it deny it? Once those things support it, okay, and maybe through the denial you find other sources. I didn't think of it that way. I didn't look at it that way. I looked at it only from my perspective. I didn't realize that people were doing it for a reason I hadn't thought of, because we often sell to ourselves, which is a terrible thing to do. Once you have that idea of, okay, well, this proves my idea, now let's take that and define it into an action. Let's truly look at who these people are, determine the data that we need to create a strategy of how much we're going to spend for the value that we're probably going to get from it, and what is the total contribution of what our efforts are, not just whether we're maintaining an ROI. Some of the things that we have to do is about branding and awareness to develop the value that then goes into the next level of conversation, which is conversion discussions. So that first part costs a lot of money. That has to get calculated into the whiz bang ROAS conversations and ROI conversations that we all beat our chests about how good we are. There's a lot of things that have to get done that don't have that direct ROI correlation that need to be a part of the market strategy. So with that, thank you for the privilege of your time and your attention to our discussions and the detail that you're willing to go with me on these discussions. I thank everyone's feedback on all the platforms that we simulcast on. We are in 39 countries and counting, and we translate in 11 plus languages. And I thank everyone that watches us after we do the live broadcast, because of the crazy time zones that exist around the world for people that do watch us. I appreciate all of that. And the fact that our TV channel, Hospitality Channel, is something you can get on Roku, Google, Apple, and Amazon. Just look for the Hospitality Channel. The live show is always on the free side of that. There is a paid gateway for additional granular data and exposure to things that are all things hospitality. Please sign up for that and get more data from us. Helpful data. It's a great place, and TV makes it an easy one. Plus, it's also on Apple iOS and Android Play, so you can do it on your iPad, phone, whatever. It's an app that you can use as well. We'll be doing more live coverage of the conferences as we begin to edit the interviews that we did at the conferences about products and services we think are worthy of your attention. Our podcast that follows this live show, we'll have a recap of the live show, but we'll get into a little bit more granularity of particular tools. A little bit like the HexaWatch, the RoboMotion, the Browse AI. These are tools that help garner the data that we're talking about, that go in and grab the data that you can put it into more usable format to create correlations and confidences with. So please listen to our podcast, which is available on 39 platforms and counting, including even Amazon's Alexa, Amazon, Google Assistant, and Siri. You just have to ask them to play the podcast, and it does. So with that, thank you for listening to our show, number 362. We're coming up into our 10th year next month, starting our 10th year next month. So we do this every week. And we thank you very much for your patronage and following us. And as always, thank you for the privilege of your time. And we look forward to talking to you next week. Bad side of a conversation by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that to me is the part that I struggle with on the travel perspectives. It's not a hesitancy, but I think it's a mental phobia of, if people didn't have agoraphobia before about what fear could happen once you left